Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight. I have another fantastic discussion for you. I'll be speaking to filmmaker and host of the Incel Project podcast, Naama Kates. We are going to be discussing the Incel movement, or Incel subculture, as it's sometimes called, or the Incel community, however you want to describe it. Now, some of you may have heard of the term Incel already, some of you may not. Its use has increased in the UK recently due to a tragic shooting in Plymouth where 5 people were murdered. More on that momentarily. But in short, the term incel describes someone who is involuntary celibate, almost certainly male, but the public discussion has very much become focused on what dangers these individuals present to women, and at times appears certainly true in the UK, it's turned into somewhat of a moral panic. At other times, just outright irresponsible claims of incel terrorism from mainstream news outlets, commentators and activist organisations. And that's something I find fascinating, this disparity between the facts versus the narrative. So, first of all, I think I need to be clear about the issue of misogyny and violence against women. Misogyny is a real thing. It exists. So is violence against women, unfortunately. Whether the gender activists want to acknowledge it or not, women, just by virtue of their biology, have unique concerns surrounding their safety. So misogyny exists, and it certainly can lead to violence against women. If women are ever going to be violently attacked or killed, you can almost guarantee it'd be at the hands of a man. However, to what extent and where it is coming from, I think needs to be better understood. The response and rhetoric certainly needs to be more proportionate. For instance, I think domestic violence is probably the biggest culprit and certainly deserves more attention and support directed towards its sufferers. You're always more likely to be killed by someone known to you, unfortunately, a spouse, a partner, a friend, a relative, than a sort of ideologically motivated stranger. This danger posed to women and general hatred for women and all things female independence and, female freedom is probably one of the main reasons I loathe fundamentalist religion so much. And I think you can see that concern of mine related to religion explicitly in my output since I started creating things around about 2012. So if I thought there was some sort of new quasi-religious incel ideology on the march committed to harming women, I'd naturally want to be all over it. But it's just not what I see when I look at this, and it's especially not true in the context of recent events in the UK. As many of you may have seen, we recently had a mass shooting in a place called Plymouth. 22-year-old white male shooter killed his mum at their home and then killed 4 others in his immediate vicinity. This included a father and a very young infant daughter. He took his own life as well. Now, the ingredients of this are already terrible enough. There is no excuse for it. It can be condemned in its entirety. However, for some reason, our news media, commentators, organisations committed themselves to making matters worse by lying about the nature of these murders and creating a moral panic around it. Instantly, organisations and news outlets ran with headlines about incel terror attacks. And this was in spite of the authorities almost immediately releasing a statement saying this wasn't being investigated as terror-related, i.e. ideological. I think the Centre for Countering Digital Hate declared it an act of terrorism carried out by an incel and started talking up the threat posed to women. And it became some huge issue with feminists too. It was used as a springboard to create panic around the general safety of women in society. Even though a number of the killer's victims were male and appeared to be chosen at random. So the truth is the facts just didn't support claims of terrorism, let alone incel terrorism. And this was clear almost immediately to anyone that knows the bare minimum about defining terrorism and linking actions to ideology. And unfortunately, anyone daring to make this point was accused of being an incel apologist or whitewashing violence against women. I think even as recently as the 28th of September, the Deputy Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism in the UK reiterated that this was not a terrorist attack, yet the articles and comment pieces claiming otherwise continue to flow. So I don't know if they believe there is some sort of conspiracy at the highest level to pretend this isn't terror-related, or do they think they know better than the most senior figures in counter-terrorism, or could there be a sort of political bias at play in their commitment to describing this as terrorism? It's really fascinating to me how a chattering class that will bend over backwards to ignore the ideological aspects of Islamic terrorism when those aspects are being waved in your face, were suddenly able to detect the ideological motivations of a non-Muslim attacker that simply were not there. So really wanted to better understand this whole topic, incels in general. It's not something, admittedly, I'm hugely informed on or I've shown a lot of interest in, but that's one of the best excuses really to get an expert on your podcast to talk about it, get an education. The idea is that if I learn something, my listeners may learn something too. So I reached out to filmmaker and podcaster Naama Kates because she's someone who's spoken to hundreds of self-described incels on her podcast. She's based in the States, but she was also one of the few people who wrote critically of labeling the Plymouth shooter an incel terrorist. She's someone who's taken a real deep dive into this subculture and has a better handle than most as to what sort of threat it represents, what sort of beliefs, traits and themes are constant. So we get right into all aspects during this discussion. We talk about the problem, try to understand just how big it is, what can be done, if anything, to prevent violence as a result. So please send Naama some kind words if you've enjoyed hearing from her. Her Twitter account and links to the Incel Project podcast can be found in the show notes. Oh, and a quick note, Naama has a cute little 1-year-old daughter that you may hear from sporadically throughout this discussion. Naama seems to possess that mystical mum quality of being able to somehow multitask. So the conversation flows perfectly, but feel free to take a shot of your chosen poison if you hear her young daughter attempting to contribute. You can keep up to date on this podcast at gspellchecker.com. As usual, everything I do is entirely listener audience supported. I work for you. So if you enjoy these conversations and wish to support them, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker, and it would mean a lot. Enjoy. Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to welcome filmmaker and host of the Incel Project podcast. It's Naama Kates. Naama, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I suppose my first question is, did I pronounce your first name correctly there?
Yes, you did.
Oh, good. I've been a little bit worried about that. I probably should have asked you, but I like to live dangerously.
Yeah.
Is that short for something? Does that have a meaning? It's not a name that you ever see in the wild in Britain?
No, it's not really. It's kind of a hippie.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, one of the reasons the main reason I invited you on the podcast is because you're doing a lot of work covering the quote-unquote incel movement / community, however it's termed. And it's something that not a lot of people know much about, but the word gets thrown around a lot. And it sort of struck me as a uniquely American issue for a while, but it seems to have spilled over into the British news cycle. So before we get into that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background, who you are. How would you describe what you do in general?
So, as you said in your intro, I'm a filmmaker. I come from that background. I acted in movies. I did music, wrote, produced, did all kinds of things. I guess, I just like telling stories in some medium or another. And I got really into podcasts as a medium. Just as a listener. And one of the genres I liked was true crime. I think that was in like 2016, maybe, that I started getting really into them. 2017. And I think the term incel kind of made its way onto my radar at that point. And so those things just sort of converged to make me think that that would be an interesting topic. But, now I would say for the past couple of years, I've primarily been a podcaster and sort of a consultant. I have the dubious distinction of being, called an incel expert.
So, I mean, it might be worth starting with defining that term. I mean, what is an abbreviation of, and what does that mean in general?
So the word incel is what's called a portmanteau. It's a word made up of parts of two other words, and they are involuntary and celibate. So people who are celibate, not by choice, and people that are involuntarily celibate, the categorical definition, many people would probably fit into that, meet the criteria for that at one point or another in their lives. But the incel community, I like to call it a community, as you said, it's sometimes described as a movement, which I don't really think is accurate. Sometimes I hear it described as a subculture, which is a little bit more accurate. It's a group of people that define themselves this way. They sort of self-identify by their status as involuntarily celibate, and they're mostly men, almost, overwhelmingly men. There's some debate about whether women can be incel or not. But these are mostly men and mostly on the younger side. And, they kind of came about with this term over the last several years. So incel is someone who is involuntarily celibate by definition, who, isn't getting laid or having romantic relationships despite wanting them. But when people say it, they kind of are referring to the individuals who self-identify this way.
Okay, so how did you get interested in this? I mean, people may assume that your focus on it may be due to the fact that you're part of this community or certainly an advocate for it. How would you best describe how you came involved with it?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a part of the community because, I'm a woman and, I have a child, so I'm obviously not celibate.
Yeah, we were just introduced before we started recording, so yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm not a part of it. And I didn't, some people might say I'm an advocate. Some people say I'm an apologist, which is, interesting. There's some connotation there, obviously. That word is really only used when talking about pretty morally reprehensible things. One is not a marathon runner apologist or a botanist apologist. One is usually seen as an apologist for groups like Nazis and, now incels. So that tells you a little bit something about the way this community is viewed. But I didn't, maybe you can say that I'm kind of an advocate in a way because of the work that I do, which is basically, I don't know. Someone described it to me once as an oral history. I talk to people from the incelosphere, incels, and then also researchers and experts and things on a topic on my show and just kind of let people tell their stories. I try not to have too much of a personal, point of view imbued into it, aside from, where it inevitably is. But I didn't know anything about them before I started the show. I just wanted to make an interesting show. So my work is not a result of, any kind of preference or affinity or even opinion on the community, except that I thought it would make for an interesting show. And now here I am.
How many incels would you say you've conversed with since you became interested in this topic?
Hundreds.
And what are the recurring themes? What are the bullet points that come up time and time again from these presumably young males?
So, including some of the ones that I've spoken to that aren't necessarily young. They are, some are in middle age and older. They really run the gamut. as far as their demographics go. But the bullet points are loneliness, feeling undervalued, undesired, unseen often, a really low self-esteem for the most part, terrible body image. And then I would say a certain type of thinking about culture and society that is maybe a little bit subversive. Certainly a very keen interest in sociology and history and sort of ranking and rating and categorizing things. That's something that I've just noticed. Other things that I would say that are prevalent in the community, a lot of people on the spectrum, autism spectrum, a lot of young men who have strained relationships with their families as well, and often a lot of depression and lack of motivation. A lot of young men that complain about their height and things like that too.
That's interesting. I mean, this paints a picture of a sort of outsiders or misfits, for want of a better word, almost a collection of tragic people. It almost elicits some form of sympathy from you when you think about these people who don't quite fit in society and don't quite have what they see as something positive, a relationship, a romantic relationship. However, the overwhelming narrative, especially in liberal circles and the news media, is that this is a ticking time bomb of misogyny, which will inevitably spill over into violence. In fact, it has on some occasions, and other occasions it's certainly claimed incel culture's behind it. How big of a threat is it in that sense, do you think?
I really don't believe that the incel community, and this is a very controversial thing to say, and I'm very careful about saying it. I don't know this for a fact, but just from my feeling, from my sense, I don't believe that the community itself actually poses much of a risk of violence to other people. I believe that the sort of incidents that we might see that are connected with incels or inceldom are often like school shooter type events that I think are just very complex. They're very complex cases. And I think if you look back in time, a lot of the perpetrators of things like this, as well as a lot of the people that might fight wars and, God knows what else over the millennia, are young men with nothing to lose, without family, invest in their community, or feeling that they've worked towards something that they don't want to destroy. In order to commit an atrocity like that, one generally has to feel that there's really nothing left for them and nothing else to lose. And so I think a lot of those people would kind of meet the criteria of being an incel, but I don't see that the community itself is creating these individuals. Another thing that strikes me when people talk about the threat of misogyny, misogynistic violence, a sort of big component of that is domestic violence. And those aren't incels that are committing that kind of violence. Most incels overwhelmingly don't even have many interactions or relationships with women. A lot of them are, as they would call themselves, high inhibition. Criminality is pretty low in that community, just in general. So, these are people that speak in a way that turns things outwards and externalizes their pain, but they really turn it in on themselves for the most part.
What kind of things do we see on the extreme end of it then, in terms of rhetoric? And it's not difficult to see how this sort of position in life could lead to resentment towards women in general, or maybe foster some form of entitlement or male honor kind of attitude. What do we see at the extreme end of this? And can you really draw a direct causal link?
Well, that's the difficulty, is drawing the link to mobilizing toward violence. And I don't think that anyone can do that. There are many sort of studies that they claim to, by analyzing words and making word clouds and, saying that there's a link between radical speech and radical action, but that link has not actually been made. It's understandable why people would think that, because it sort of seems to be a next step. But I don't know that it is. On the more extreme ends, there are, and this is the other thing that's sort of complicated with this population. It's all online, and they engage in something called shit posting, which, we're familiar with and came about with sort of 4chan, this kind of internet culture. And so they say a lot of things that are certainly insensitive to someone who might be reading them, but they're usually also ironic. They're usually just saying it to be shocking, to be provocative. And they're also saying it for an in-group. They're aware that people are reading this from the outside, but they're not really going out of their echo chamber, incels, I mean, and kind of coming at people outside of it. They're kind of speaking to other incels when they make some of these very absurd posts that might, refer to some killer as a saint. They do that. There's Saint Eliot. They have terms like go ER. But the thing is that really usually is just someone being shocking. So I've had one incel on my show that has said he actually would support some kind of violence, through all the people that I've spoken to. And this person was, he was 19 years old. He said that he would support a beta uprising because it would be cooler than just laying down and rotting. Those were his words. And he had also, but that he wouldn't actually do it himself. He wouldn't take part in it himself. And he'd also previously been a jihadist for about a year when he was 16. And then after that, a white supremacist, someone who wanted a white ethno state. So this was kind of an outlier.
Right, there's a lot going on there, isn't there? So,
Yeah.
I mean, this point about shit posting is very interesting to me. I don't know if you have this term in the States, but in the UK, it was, traditionally known as you were a wind-up merchant. You would wind people up for a reaction. And it's the funny thing is, in the UK, we have some I'm sure you'd be aware, very stringent speech laws, especially online. You can find yourself with a knock on the door from the police, depending on what you posted. And a few people have found themselves questioned and visited by the police for, so-called shit posting, memes, things like that. Now, are you saying that this sometimes is taken into account when people are investigating this as an indicator of extremism? People are not versed in this shit posting culture, meme culture, and they're taking this on face value, and they're perhaps amplifying this problem as worse than it is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think they often try to acknowledge the fact that there is shit posting and that they know that it's memes, but they try to make the case that regardless, using certain kinds of language, like one that, stands out now just thinking about it from a study, is that they use the word foid or femoid for woman, a feminoid, thing that looks like a female, but is actually just, an imitation. And this is a word they use, I guess it's offensive, but it's a pretty silly word, in my opinion. And, there are some academics that have tried to make the case that dehumanizing language, when used enough, I guess, leads to actual dehumanization that can lead to violence.
Right.
I don't know that that's not true. And I'm sure that there is, there's certainly a connection between language and behavior. And I can see how using a certain language to refer to people can affect the way that you feel about them. But just from my experience, which is not academic, but, more sort of hands-on in a way, I don't see that incels that I speak to that say foid or femoid are violent or becoming more violent as a result of using those words or those memes. There are just so many that I talk to that partake in the memes and the language, which is kind of their unique language, but then also have, budding relationships with women that they want to pursue. And, it's complicated. I just don't really see that playing out.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's generally considered a red flag, isn't it? Dehumanization, but I suppose it depends in the sincerity of it. If it's just a term, a joking term or disparaging, I suppose there are levels to it. This conversation's become massive in the UK due to fairly recent events, which I know you're aware of. I just wondered, before we touch on that, what's the conversation like in the States? Who's talking about this, and in what sort of way is it being spoken about? Are we getting people in government now recognizing this and speaking about it? And if so, are they, in your opinion, speaking about it sensibly?
They are speaking about it in government. In the past couple of years, there has been sort of a surge of interest in incels, some academic papers written by people from sort of a counterterrorism or security lens about the new domestic threat, the threat of incel violence. So people are speaking about it. And I would say that the range of conversation is probably pretty similar to what you have in the UK. For the most part, in the sort of literati circles and academia, there is a very strong reaction to it that I would say is similar to the one presented for white supremacy now, that people who are part of these bigoted groups, whether it's a racist group or misogynistic group, are presenting something of a domestic terror threat. And a lot of think pieces about misogyny and entitled white men and things like that. There's also a lot of conflation between that, incels and white men, even though it's not a majority white population, actually, which a lot of people are surprised to find.
Also, in your experience, you've spoke to more people who are non-white than white who identify as incel?
I've spoken to about the same amount, I'd say.
Right.
And polls of their community that have pretty, big sample size show that it's about 50-50, even a little bit more, maybe non-white. And given that this is taking place, mostly in Europe and North America, where there's a lot of internet access and English internet. That's, I think, that would be maybe even underrepresenting white men a little bit, given that that's where, where these people are from.
This is also thrown into the same basket as sort of QAnon and conspiracy theories and Pizzagate and or any sort of crackpot far-right movement. In the word incel isn't far behind in the discussion, and what is the overlap there in your mind? A lot, little, none.
I think there's a good amount of overlap because these are the echo chambers that are banned from the respectable platforms like Reddit and Twitter and wherever else. They're banned from these conversations, as are people on the far right and some of the other groups. So I think partly it's just where the conversations happen. And then there's also some borrowing because these are kind of reactionary points of view. I would say that the mainstream right now in both of our countries, at least in sort of the way that the media represents it, tends to be more progressive. And there's some overlap in the sense that these groups tend to be a little anti-progressive, maybe. Feminism is a big issue. So there's kind of a language overlap. But I think that they're still very different. I think that, incels as a group is just inherently a very different group than a white supremacist group, or even something like QAnon. White supremacists, for instance, have this pride in belonging to the group, and incels certainly don't.
Okay, so we've covered a number of the traits and things that link incels and the kind of rhetoric they come out with, and I'm trying to get to where the underlying cause is. I'm trying to think if things have changed within the male population to create a situation where there's so much discontent and resentment and self-loathing, or whether or not they just have an outlet to express it now online. I'm trying to get my mind around whether human relationships have changed so much to create this issue, or are we just hearing about it more? What's your perception on this?
I think that both of those things are true. I think that, our populations with this technology, it's both the phenomenon that you hear the loudest voices from the most kind of fringe groups more because they're just louder, and also because our social media sort of promotes that kind of content more. I also think it's led to kind of a fracturing of the society to where people want to label. I mean, there's something that I find that the group has in common with others, which is a victimhood narrative, and labeling of oneself and saying, I'm this, and this is why society's against me, and these are my grievances. So I think there's a lot of that going on just in general now. And then I also think that people are more isolated, interactions are increasingly done online, which presents a very sort of false, curated image. There's a lot of narcissism. There are dating apps, which sort of set these young men at a disadvantage, often if they don't present in a certain way. And they have a lot of studies to back that up. So I think there's a lot going on.
Do you think there's an aspect of the proliferation of porn that might play into this a little bit? We have a generation of young men coming through now, and I appreciate it runs the gamut, as you said, and it's not just young men, but we have a generation of teenage men coming through now, and they're one of the first generations to have access in their pocket on their smartphone to sexually explicit content at the touch of a button, which is something my generation didn't have. And I suppose it can sort of provide this advertisement of what maybe a sexual relationship is, and make men have a different attitude towards sex and relationships that they maybe wouldn't have had without that. Have you seen any recurring themes regarding porn?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic. I think that it's the access to porn. It can lead them to have unrealistic expectations. And I think in some subtle way, it does just open them up to these ideas about women, and to have these conversations about women in other places, other corners of the internet, about women being deceitful and things like partner count and all this stuff that I can't say it comes directly from porn, but I think it opens that conversation up at a much younger age for people with virtually no life experience, and certainly no experience with women or with, romantic relationships or getting to know women. So yes, porn being the objectifying 2D, false image that it is, it just contributes to the detachment from, reality and from actually getting to know other human beings.
What's fascinating to me is that you've spent so much time actually talking to these people. I mean, doing the role of an actual journalist, and speaking to these people, hearing what they have to say and trying to better understand it. And that helps to further everyone else's understanding, of course. But obviously the society or the narrative tends to suggest these are all hateful, misogynistic, dangerous monsters. So an aspect of that would be to accuse you of victim blaming. In that sense, you are trying to sort of soft pedal these really nefarious ideologies and individuals. Did you get that accusation a lot? I think you mentioned the term apologist at the start of the podcast. And how do you respond to it?
Well, yes, I do get that accusation. And I just want to know, of the people that I speak to, who are their victims? I don't speak to people who, victimize anyone. They're victimizing themselves alone in their room into a computer. You certainly can't paint all of them with that brush. When it comes to the victims of the crimes, I just think that in that respect, they would say that what I'm doing is, I'm whitewashing this community. And in that, I'm also misleading all these people that are far smarter than I am in government and academia and elsewhere. and my audience, and then also platforming their ideology. And I just don't do that. I let people talk on my show. They mostly talk about their problems. The ideology, as it were, is not really, the black pill, that's what it's called, isn't really an ideology that anyone can sum up. It's mostly just a depressing sort of collection of studies that lead to a very cruel portrayal of humanity in general. And yes, women specifically. But I had my most recent episode was with someone whose cousin was actually a victim of the Montreal massacre in 1989, which a lot of people think of as the kind of proto incel killing. But, I have people on my show who often aren't accustomed to being in media, to speaking on any kind of media, or with women sometimes, or, speaking voice at all. I've had people on that have said, you're the first person I've talked to voice chat in some amount of months, or, whatever. And they are coming on my show and being candid and giving of their time. I don't really find it appropriate to put them in a gotcha moment or ask them to answer for this killing that happened in 2015 or whatever. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that it would lead to productive conversation either.
It's interesting because the thought of not having spoke to somebody for months, to me, is such a foreign idea to me. And I think it's very easy to forget sometimes that if you're in a sort of healthy headspace and you have, relationships, loving relationships, you have somewhere to go, people to be with, you sometimes can forget that there is entire swaths of societies that have absolutely none of that sort of live amongst us. So, what's the solution out of this? What is the best way to change the direction of these individuals' lives? How can we better integrate these people into society and obviously reduce the chance of some spilling over into violence or atypical behavior?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And if we knew the answer to that, hopefully people would do something to implement it. But I think just on an individual level, it's just really the basics of being kind to people, not judging them. There's a lot of talk about tolerance these days for various different types of people. And this is a type of person, and maybe we can be tolerant to them too. And I think that just having more honest conversations too, publicly and privately, about some of these topics, which are things, that they have questions about, like, why don't women like me, or what do women like, or what makes a good man? Just sort of conversations about being, a good full person and values, and how to sort of make the most of one's life. Those are conversations that need to be had. I think also, they will refer to people as giving blue-pilled advice or being blue pillars, normies, when talking about people that paint an overly rosy picture of humanity and of reality. And when people just deny outright that people do judge based on appearance, and that, a certain factor might be deemed more attractive or something. And it might indeed be very difficult to find someone, for anyone, that you actually connect with and can have a meaningful relationship with. And that's one of the sort of, I would say, biggest challenges in life for people, or one of the most important, that it's not easy. And I think if we're honest about those things, then maybe people would be more likely to listen to other sources rather than this one source that is the only one that seems to them to give them a truthful answer, and makes them therefore much more likely to accept anything they reach there.
Yeah. There's an aspect of this that I think if I'd thought about 20 years ago, or even uttered it 20 years ago, I would have been laughed off screen, and rightly so. But is there something in this idea of the the directionless, forgotten male demographic in sort of 2021 Western civilization, where men seem to be being left behind. There seems to be a sort of rebalance in terms of equality, affording women all the rights they fully deserve, and women seem to be excelling in most metrics that you can measure. Men, not so much, tend to be obviously at the far reaches of, you look at the world's billionaires, etc., but they also seem to scale down at the lowest positions in society as well. We talk about education, homelessness, health, things like that. Do we have a problem with just the male identity in general at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, people talk about male privilege or men having power, but clearly some males don't have any power at all, or really any privilege. And these are they, and it's true that there's all kinds of statistics I used to know better, but about, young people being sexually active or not. There's like a larger percentage of men that are just not at all, of young men. The male suicide rates have gone up a lot. Males enrolling in college have gone down. There are lots of factors like this. And I think that, it's true that a lot has been done in recent years, fortunately, to kind of make up for the gap between male and female achievement that has existed for so long because of our societal structures. And I think that maybe it's gotten to the point where in most ways that's pretty much even. But then the sort of sensitivities we have for women, the outreach, the body positivity type of movements, and the self-esteem talk, and the the deeming of criticizing women in certain ways as being hateful speech that gets censored and banned, that still exists for women and it doesn't for men. And these men are expressing loneliness and pain and a grievance and things that should be relatable to people, and they are being laughed at for it. That does not seem fair to me.
That's really interesting. And I suppose in a way, a lot of people listening to this, and I've certainly had this experience, would dismiss this sort of thing as quote unquote conservative talking points or right-wing talking points. So I'm certainly not on the right. I don't class myself as a conservative. I don't see it as a dirty word, however. And I'm just wondering, where would you place yourself on the political scale? Is it even possible to know anymore, given how sort of divisive the conversations become on politics in general?
I mean, no, I really try to avoid doing that, which I think irritates people in all camps. I think that both sides of that conversation have changed so much. It's become such a kind of a incendiary topic, where people really look down on and have sort of like a hatred for someone on the other side of that camp. I would say that on an issue by issue basis, I have my opinions, but I don't see a home really in either side.
Yeah.
Now.
Labels aren't always useful. I think that as the least useful they've ever been in a political sense at the moment. Well, one of the reasons your work caught my attention, the main reason, in fact, is we had a tragedy recently in the UK, a shooting, and obviously this is big news in the UK because shootings are so rare.
That one.
You did, and that's what caught my eye. And you were making sense in a way that nobody else seemed able to. I kind of instinctively rejected some of the claims from the media, but you managed to articulate it in a way that was much clearer to me. And I'm talking about the shooting in a place called Plymouth in the UK. Now, this is a young man. I think he may have been 22. I'll have to check that. And he shot his mother and a couple of other people nearby, including men and a very young child and a father. It was a horrendous crime. And then, I can't remember, I think he killed himself as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is terrible enough on every level, and there's plenty of questions being asked and still being asked about his mental state and his access to firearms and who dropped the ball there. But the media for a long time, straight after that, ran with the headlines that this was a form of incel terrorism. There seems somewhat of a bit of excitement in the chattering classes when a young white man commits an atrocity. They seem to come out to bat for that in ways they wouldn't for, say, Islamist terror in this country. So you were one of the voices out there saying this isn't incel terrorism. And what did you see, or what did you research in regards to this individual that made you so sure of making that claim?
Well, I had access to his Reddit profile, his history, so all his posts on Reddit, and his YouTube, which was, both of those things were deleted pretty shortly after. But I have
my... Just ask, who does that? I'm assuming YouTube does that. Is that a policy that YouTube has?
Yeah, I think I know that in the wake of the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, when the host of that was nothing like YouTube, it was 8kun, derivative of 4chan, and then 8chan, really came under a lot of heat for having that on there. So now
he live streamed the attack, didn't he?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that now, platforms like YouTube, probably does it pretty sensibly, just wanting to avoid copycats. I think that's the objective. I think Reddit does it to excess. I mean, any mention of a word that they determine to be, on the wrong side of an argument, and they'll just ban and delete things. That's the way Reddit has been lately. But it's not really, usually when they do it, they'll give justification that has to do with their terms of service. That's, sometimes a little bit murky, but they do what they want, basically. But I went through his content, his sort of online digital footprint, and I just saw that he was not someone who was very active with the incel community. He never called himself an incel. He seemed to, relate to them, but he went out of his way to distinguish himself from them. He was involved in subreddits, some of them that were kind of anti-incel or about leaving the incel movement. And there were times that he called the black pill bullshit. And he just seemed to have a lot of other issues. And then the nature of the attack, also, there was no manifesto. There wasn't any evidence of planning. He clearly wasn't like a committed incel, if he was one. And also the attack, to me, a lot of people looked at this content and said, oh, it was obvious he was really like going off the rails and he was becoming suicidal and all of that. And I didn't really see evidence of that. I mean, it seemed like someone who was unhappy enough to be suicidal, but it didn't seem like a clear direction. And then he shot his mother. That was the first person he shot. That's not usually terrorism. That's not usually ideological. That's usually very personal. And everything that followed seemed very random. Seemed like the first person that was there. You don't hear of incel killings if there are such things as, shooting men and women and a small child, if they're doing it to sort of further a cause. It, to me, didn't seem obvious that it was even planned.
Yeah, I mean, on first reading and everything I've read since, it sort of strikes me as your typical domestic incident with obviously a lethal weapon thrown into the mix. And we see this time and time again, certainly in the States. But so what's going on here? Because I get a little bit frustrated because I spend a lot of my time... in Europe, we have a big problem with Islamic fundamentalism, and that manifests itself often into terrorism. And you can draw a direct line of causation. These jihadists are very open about their motivations. They leave manifestos. They tell us explicitly why they're doing what they're doing. But liberal commentators will tend to ignore that aspect of it and try and talk about other areas, being disenfranchised, for instance, being on the receiving end of bigotry, etc. So when there's a clear ideological path, they tend to ignore it. However, in the case of this murderer from Plymouth, it's very sketchy, yet they can suddenly see this perfect line between incel ideology and these murders. So this feels very politically motivated. What's happening here where we're in this situation?
Well, I think it is politically motivated. I think it clearly is. I think there's clearly a reluctance to maybe call out some Islamist terrorism because that has been done in the past in a way that was maybe prejudicial. People don't want to be that way. They don't want to be racist, notably, and then sort of an eagerness to make I don't know, I guess you could call it the boogeyman of the day, which is a young white man, an ideologically motivated killer, because that's their camp. And, I don't want to get too political. I also think that a lot of the people that say these things are not so calculated. I think that they probably genuinely believe them. They genuinely think that there's a wave of misogynist terrorists coming, that they have to, fear for their lives over. But I think that they're lying to themselves. I think that maybe it's possible to draw a link between misogyny and violence for sure, but I don't think that this, what's sometimes called male supremacist sect, has an ideology that they're spreading around. I mean, for instance, one of the pieces that I responded to when I wrote about this was, I think it was a Guardian piece with the I think psychologist and writer Laura Bates, who wrote a book about this topic in a way, and claimed that there was, active recruitment. There were recruitment tactics being used by incels to get people to join their ranks. And that just doesn't go on. There's no recruitment, there's no movement, there's no goal. You'll hardly hear any incel talking about any kind of organizing to do anything. They're not, this isn't a cause that they're really championing, that there's no promise of, a better life. They don't really have any hope for anything to change for the most part. They're just very kind of nihilistic and miserable.
So there's no evangelism, really. It's just a group of like-minded people that have somehow managed to find each other thanks to the internet.
Yeah. And, I do think that there's something kind of inherently chemically satisfying about reading something that seems like propaganda in a way over and over again. And I think that it can serve that way. You hear a lot of incels kind of repeating some talking points about women and some of their terms they come up with. But in all of that stuff, there's no directive to do anything. There's just, women think this way. It's over for sub-8 men. All women are like that. Have to be 6 feet, 6 figures, and whatever else they say. But that's kind of, I don't know. I think it's very different when there's no call for violence or call to change things.
It's interesting because when that Plymouth shooting happened, almost immediately the police announced that they were not investigating this as a terrorist incident. Yet the articles kept coming. Various interest groups outright declared this as a misogynistic act of terror. And even now, in recent weeks, the police chief, I forgot the gentleman's name, Mr. Jacks, I think he's called.
Jack.
That's the chap. He's come out and obviously stipulated that it's not terrorist related, but we still have, I think, Guardian articles arguing the point. So, yes. I mean, it almost feels like they want it to be terrorism at this point. It almost feels like they want this to be a bigger danger and threat than it actually is on the face of it.
It does feel like that. It does. And it's a very cynical thing to say. I don't know if it's true or the motivation for that, if it's just that it would feel good for them to be right about something, or perhaps it would justify certain people's careers, you know? But it definitely feels like that.
So harking back to something that I find very interesting, and that's this idea of whenever there's a crime committed that garners a lot of media attention, their Reddit profiles, YouTube accounts, often Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts are closed down by the tech giants. And I appreciate the necessity of that in regards to not showing live streams of crimes and, horrendous acts of murder. And I suppose you could make the argument that it stops them propagating their worldview after they've gone. But it also creates this environment where we're all sort of trying to guess what that person believes, what that person's about. And I think this can also play into this media cycle of everyone just filtering it through their own political pet projects rather than trying to understand it because they don't have all the information. So where do you fall on this line between the ultimate freedom of expression and having, murderers having their Twitter accounts closed down, etc.?
When it comes to that, I think that one of the sort of patterns that I see is that these sorts of shooters are copycats. A lot of them, the ones, whether they say they're incel or something else, they've had fascination with, mass murderers from a young age that also vary in their ideologies or whatever you want to call that. And they want notoriety. And I do think that there's something to giving them that is ill-advised. Maybe all this attention, this very sensationalistic coverage, and that includes the think pieces about them being incel or not, that certainly tips over, any kind of attention that they're getting or notoriety that they might think they'll get. That certainly contributes to it. I do think that, it's maybe, I don't really know about that. I think the problem with it is more that people do speculate on it anyway, and do so, in the mainstream media. This isn't just people talking amongst themselves or even on social media. They wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't coming from, the institutions at first. So they're opening that conversation up, and then the accounts are shut down. And I think there's also kind of a sense of like this secrecy, like, oh, we're in the know, to it, that rubs me the wrong way. If you're going to close something down, maybe treat it as if there were a pending trial, and nobody should really be speculating about it, not close it down and then have all these think pieces come out and leave the internet sleuths to start chasing their tails. It should be kind of more uniform than that, whichever direction we go.
Yeah, you touched on something interesting there, because there's been studies and claims in recent years that obviously reporting on these things just increases the instances of these things. You see this with suicides, apparently, terror attacks. So people make arguments about underreporting these things, or perhaps not printing the killer's face or name, etc. And I seem to remember a while back there was a huge amount of frenzy in media circles about the Joker movie starring Joaquin Phoenix, and nobody had seen it at the time. No one knew what it was about, really, but there was this narrative where people were utterly convinced this was going to usher in some sort of incel violence. It almost felt like the media were trying to prod people into committing an act of violence at the time.
To make it happen, yeah.
So I suppose my question is, what sort of influences or responsibilities the media have here in these instances? I mean, not to get too conspiratorial and say the media can sort of control what we think and how we feel about things, but it's undeniable that it has an influence on society and culture in general. In the world of the internet, I suppose my question, where anyone can upload a video, you can get a million articles out before the end of the day on any topic. What is this doing to our psyche as a society, and what is this specifically doing to the incel movement?
I think it has a huge responsibility. I know not just in the case of incels, but any kind of out group. media attention, negative media attention, which is what it usually is a great recruitment tool for those that want to participate in that. And, I don't think incels do, but it certainly feeds into a persecution narrative, if there is one, and there usually is. And I think that people now, because of, people like to blame a lot of things on social media, and I certainly not exempt from that. I think social media has had some terrible consequences, but I think that the conversations that take place on social media that have so much influence usually start with traditional media. I think that most of the conversations come from stuff that is covered in traditional mainstream media, whether it's, a news outlet or a TV news channel or whatever it is. That still gets an audience that is unmatched by a lot of these upstart kind of fledgling media platforms and outlets. But it's not just those really mainstream, but them too. I think that people have a lot more time to kind of talk with like-minded strangers. I'm using that term kind of loosely, but people in their echo chamber about whatever topic is sort of generated and then put out in from traditional media. I think that a lot of these topics would not be even, I don't know. I think that the whole incels with terrorism, that whole phenomenon, or the story of the phenomenon, definitely started with media, because Elliot Rodger, who's considered the first, incel killer, didn't even use the term incel ever. And you can certainly say that he fit the mold and was an incel. There's some of them say he wasn't, but I'd say he is. But the media, it was the media stories that made that, an incel killing. And everyone since has kind of been a copycat of that.
Do you have time for a couple of quick questions from Twitter?
Sure.
Okay. So I've got one from a chap, I assume it's a chap, Luke Dargist. He's asked, is there a norm of self-destructive behaviour in the community, and do they use mental health services? I am curious about their worldview on coping and finding a way to get better. Thank you. Get better as in quotation marks there.
Okay. Well, a lot of them have gone to mental health services. More than half, I think, have tried or been in the mental health system. And most of them overwhelmingly are not happy with the treatment. I guess a lot of them think, well, it won't. I just had a conversation very recently for my show with one who's very, very depressed. And just, I was saying, you're at a point that it doesn't make sense to live this way, and you should maybe try some mental health treatment again. And he said, well, it won't cure my loneliness. It won't make me not die alone, So there is a little bit of that thinking going on. I think some of them, it's a chicken or the egg. Like, does their depression and mental health contribute to their inceldom, or is it just the inceldom making them depressed? And that can be kind of a complicated question to unpack. But I think mental health practitioners should maybe become a little bit more familiar with this status.
I mean, you mentioned autism earlier and how that there's an overlap, and not a whole, great deal is known about autism and how it manifests and how people live with it. And obviously this is getting better. There's more people talking about it. There's more organisations and advocacy groups and things like that. And I just wondered, what are your thoughts on this, Linky? Is there any things that flag up in terms of autism and incel where you can say, okay, I can kind of understand a way in from one to the other? Or is it just an interesting aspect of it where you've noticed it does correlate?
I like to be careful about this too, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But I have to say the former, because with autism, one of the kind of hallmarks of the condition is trouble with reading social cues and expressing emotions and sort of being appropriately emotional in social situations. So that seems pretty direct to me, that people that have difficulties with these issues would end up being ones having difficulties with relationships and might also be on the receiving end of bullying and feeling like they don't fit in. So, I think that's a pretty obvious connection. And there's something like 20% of the community, according to their polls, is formally diagnosed autism spectrum, which is staggering, really high. It's something like 1% for the general population. And then another 20% think that they might be on the spectrum, but they don't have a diagnosis. So there's that. And then I also think that there are elements of that, kind of hyper focus on certain topics and black and white thinking, sometimes esoteric interests that just fit in with the typology of a lot of incels, and also make it more difficult to see nuance in, what they read about maybe human behavior and mating, and make it difficult to accept answers that are not definitive. Sometimes I'll try to have conversations with them about, one of their favorite topics, which is like what women value in men. And there's all these kind of ephemeral things that can't be proven with data necessarily here. Like, this is how I show you that, yes, actually personality really does matter, and intelligence and sense of humor and all these things. And for someone with kind of a more rigid way of thinking, it's difficult to accept that. So it's very, very prevalent.
Last question from someone called Steve. He says he recently heard an interview saying incel was a term for someone who was essentially afraid to commit because of the potential to be hurt emotionally or financially. Is this accurate, or is it a term for people who are unable to attract the opposite sex and are angry about it?
He's thinking of MGTOW.
Right.
So men going their own way, MGTOW. That's the group that usually older men, often divorced, that are no longer willing to commit to women. So it's also in the manosphere, but a different group.
That's interesting. Naama, you've been absolutely excellent. Lots learned for me personally then. I'm sure my listeners and viewers will get a lot from this. Is there anything you'd like to point people towards? Where can they find your podcast, for instance, before I let you get back to what's left of your day?
My podcast is found wherever podcasts are found, and it's just called Incel. So it's pretty easy to find, and I'm on Twitter and nothing else really.
Excellent. I'll make sure I put links to those things in the show notes. But Naama, thank you very much for coming on and speaking to me. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great.